Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
Will there be food in this house today, or what? The father of the family asked loudly and indignantly. Rui, dear, but we just had dinner. Nora, in surprise, looked at her husband, who was sitting in front of an empty plate, holding a spoon, and looking expectantly at her. She had fed the whole family a modest dinner and resolutely didn't understand what exactly was expected of her. The children had already eaten long ago and dispersed to their rooms to do their things. Oh, so that was dinner? Rui asked mockingly. And here I thought dinner should at least include some meat, especially in a man's portion. You might be fine with a cabbage leaf for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but I actually work, bring money to the family, and, as I thought, have the right to expect normal food for that money. Nora bit her lip. She belatedly realized that the old story was starting again, repeating itself each time the month was coming to an end. Each time her husband approached the conversation differently than the previous one. That's why she didn't immediately understand what he meant. She sighed heavily. She didn't want to start this pointless argument again, which would only lead to another quarrel and nothing more. She had heard all of Rodrigo's arguments many times and had responded with her own many times. But the spouses could not come to an agreement. Nothing new, Nora was sure of it. Neither of them had come up with anything new, so the continuation of this conversation would be just as meaningless as before. Nevertheless, she knew her husband was waiting for her response, and keeping silent was also not an option. 2 or 3 times she had already tried to apply such a tactic, and she was completely dissatisfied with the result. Rui, Nora began carefully, we have discussed this many times. Is it worth starting it again and? It is worth it, her husband resolutely interrupted her. We will have this conversation until the situation changes, more precisely, until you come to your senses and finally get a job. I can't, after all, carry you all on my back forever. Nora threw up her hands. Dear, how can I go to work? The little ones aren't taken to the kindergarten yet. There are no places anywhere. We wouldn't even afford a nanny even if I got a job. Well, others manage somehow, even without any nannies. But others have grandmothers, grandfathers, sisters, and brothers, someone else, but we have no one. I'm an orphan, and your parents absolutely do not want to take care of the children even for half a day so that I can find some part-time job. And don't start blaming my parents again. They raised their children and are not obliged to fuss over yours. Nora froze on the spot. She even stopped washing the dishes, which she had begun doing during this awkward conversation. Just one word caused her such pain as if her husband had hit her. However, she wasn't sure if a physical blow would have been less painful. What do you mean by yours? She exclaimed. They are our children, Rui. You wanted them just as much as I did. Rodrigo smirked in a very unpleasant way. Wanted, but changed my mind, he said. We never agreed that I would have to carry this whole horde on my back. I thought you'd take some time off for maternity leave, and then, like all normal people, go back to work. And since you're now a housewife, the kids are entirely your responsibility. I don't have much to do with them. Nora felt as if someone's strong fingers were squeezing her throat. These statements were something new. Rui had never allowed himself such remarks before. Yes, he complained about having to feed the family alone. Yes, he lamented that on his salary, not particularly large, his wife couldn't provide him with what he considered necessary. But he never claimed that their children had nothing to do with him. Rui, as if reading her thoughts and certainly seeing her state, decided, apparently, to completely finish off his wife. As for those youngest ones, whom you actively use to cover your laziness, he said, I'm not even sure they're mine. I was working all day while you were on maternity leave with Raphael. Who knows who could have visited you during that time? Of course, Nora couldn't bear such unfair accusations. Gasping, sobbing with tears, almost blindly, she fled from the kitchen. Without realizing how, she ended up in the children's room. 6-year-old Raphael, watching over his younger brother and sister, looked up at her in surprise. "Mom," he asked in a tone unusually serious for his age, "what happened?" "Nothing, son, everything is fine." Nora, belatedly realizing her mistake, tried to discreetly wipe away her tears. The boy looked at her intently, then glanced at the younger children and slowly nodded. Obviously, he decided that Mom didn't want to upset the little ones, and that's why she was pretending everything was fine. Nora didn't dissuade him and quietly left the room, closing the door behind her. She hoped that by the next day, Raphael would have more important things to do and wouldn't remember this incident. The woman had no idea where to go with her sorrow. There were only 2 rooms in their apartment, the children's and the adults', and her husband could enter the second at any moment. She didn't want to see him now. Moreover, she suspected that he would not easily give up his favorite topic and would continue to upset her with his remarks. The only option was to leave the apartment, despite the late hour. Of course, leaving the children virtually alone wasn't the best decision. On the other hand, in such a state, she clearly couldn't interact with them properly, so whether she was in the apartment or not didn't really matter. The younger ones would still remain under Raphael's care. At least Nora was certain that he would put them to bed properly, and he himself would go to sleep on time. Her son, mature beyond his years, loved to take care of his brother and sister. Of course, the woman tried not to allow the children to be alone for long, but when Raphael took care of the younger ones in her presence, she saw that he coped well with them. Yes, she was definitely lucky with her son, and at that moment, it was the only consolation for the woman. She aimlessly wandered the streets, barely looking around. She didn't even notice the light, annoying drizzle that had started. All her thoughts were focused on one single question: how had she come to such a life? How had her happy youthful love ended with her husband openly accusing her of infidelity, without any basis? Nora remembered how they met. She was a young student at the economics faculty of one of the country's leading universities. He was a promising young entrepreneur. Together, they seemed to everyone, and to themselves, like the perfect couple. Their relationship unfolded like in a romantic tale: courtship, gifts, restaurants, huge luxurious bouquets of flowers. A great future awaited both of them, and hardly anyone could imagine the poverty and hopelessness in which these people now found themselves. This fall began, perhaps, the very moment Rodrigo began to insistently persuade his future wife to leave the institute. "Why do you need this?" he questioned. "My income is enough for both of us. You'll stay at home, cook, clean, raise children, after all." At first, Nora flatly refused to even consider it. Raised in an orphanage, having every chance of ending up at the very bottom of life, she had incredibly managed to break into decent society and was now clinging to this opportunity with all her might. However, Rodrigo eventually convinced her that this wonderful new world would not disappear from her life. Initially, everything was indeed good. Nora, as Rui planned, was setting up their shared home while he was busy with his business. They had more than enough money, yet they never seemed to save. There were always some unnecessary but pleasant things they wanted to buy right away. Neither of them thought about the need for savings. "In case of anything, my parents will help us," Rodrigo reassured his young wife when she timidly started the conversation. "You know, they are not struggling." Nora still didn't know. Did he believe what he said back then, or was he deceiving her, confident that the critical situation would never arise? Either way, something happened to his business after a while. Nora didn't delve into the details and knew only that eventually it started to bring less and less profit until it finally collapsed. And at that moment, it turned out that Rodrigo's parents were not going to help the young family. "Apart from you," his father told him, "we have younger children who have not yet become independent, and you are already an adult man who should deal with his problems." They had to sell their luxurious large apartment where they lived and moved to a small 2-room apartment on the outskirts of the city. Surprisingly, Rodrigo was the most dissatisfied with this turn of events. Apparently, having spent his whole life in luxury, he now had to lead a rather miserable existence. Nora, on the other hand, accepted this with philosophical calmness. Of course, she had also grown unaccustomed to a poor life, but she had once lived it, so she was more prepared for various difficulties and knew exactly what to do in such conditions. She quickly found a job as a shop assistant. The salary was modest, but it was better than nothing. She saw no other options. Rodrigo chose a completely different path to solve their problems. He went on a long-term drinking binge. Nora didn't blame her husband. Life is unpredictable. As a good wife, she tried to inspire, calm, and support him. Finally, her efforts paid off. Rodrigo stopped drinking and began developing new business ideas to bring their family back to wealth and prosperity. However, these ideas never really worked out. Even if they managed to save some initial amount and start a new venture, various difficulties soon arose, negating all of Rodrigo's efforts. The longer this went on, the more unbearable his character became. "I don't have enough money to fully implement my projects," he openly told Nora. "But what can I do, dear?" She responded. "I'm already taking all the extra shifts I can, working almost without days off. There's simply no way for me to earn more. Of course, it would have been much easier if I had finished university, but there's no use regretting that now. This situation should be a lesson for both of us. I need to finish my education and find a proper job. Besides, as I said, we'll need savings. But of course, that's a plan for when we get out of. How are we going to get out of this?" Her husband protested. "Well, for us to have more money," Nora timidly suggested, "you could find some part-time work, even for half a day." "I don't have time for that," Rodrigo stated categorically. "In case you haven't noticed, while you're slaving away for pennies, I'm trying to rebuild our business and restore our former status, and you're not helping me at all." "But I really am doing everything I can," Nora replied in surprise. "No," he retorted with clear irritation. "Not everything. There's something you still haven't done, even though I've explained to you many times how important it is for both me and you. Dear, you seem to forget that although I didn't complete my education, I did study economics for 2 years. What you're suggesting is absolute madness. Maybe you'll finally start trusting me in matters where I do know something?" "You just don't believe in me," Rodrigo replied with a saddened voice. "You think that because if I made a mistake once, I'll keep making them forever, and I'll never succeed in anything." After such statements, Nora would immediately try to convince her husband that he was deeply mistaken and that no one believed in him as strongly as she did. Ultimately, these conversations would end in nothing, only to resume the next day. Nevertheless, no matter how hard Rodrigo tried, Nora couldn't agree to his plan. He proposed a very simple thing: to take out a large loan in her name to invest in his business. Being bankrupt and officially unemployed, no bank would lend to him, so he couldn't realize his idea without his wife's help. Nora urged him to consider how exactly they would repay this loan in case of another failure. She was absolutely certain that this was not a path to regaining their previous status, but a descent into an even deeper pit, and fortunately, she never succumbed to her husband's persuasions. Then she became pregnant with Felito, and Rodrigo had to abandon all his business ideas and finally get a job to feed the soon-to-be larger family. He wasn't thrilled about this prospect, but both spouses still believed that this situation was temporary. Nora didn't plan to stay on maternity leave for long and intended to return to work as soon as she could place her son in kindergarten. But this plan too was doomed. There were categorically no places in kindergartens, and soon Nora realized that dreaming of it was futile. It would be good if the queue came up in 3 or 4 years. Then it turned out that she got pregnant again, just as Felito turned 3, and gave birth to 2 more children. That's when Rodrigo slowly started talking about her returning to work. She understood this herself, but how was it possible with 3 small children in her arms? Over time, her husband became more insistent, and the situation did not change, resulting in the disgraceful conflict that occurred that unfortunate evening. That's what Nora was thinking about, aimlessly wandering in the night's darkness through the streets of the neighborhood that had become almost her own over the years. Fortunately, although it was on the outskirts of the city, it was considered a safe area. Crimes here were extremely rare, so moving around even at this late hour was quite safe. However, she thought of this last. Suddenly, something strange caught her attention. Nora, absorbed in her gloomy thoughts and memories, didn't immediately realize what alarmed her. It was as if a neon sign flashed in her subconscious, indicating that something in her surroundings was amiss. Emerging from her thoughts, she looked around and quickly noticed the cause of her vague unease. It was a little girl, Felito's age. Dressed in her ornate pink dress, she sat alone on the curb, looking at the asphalt under her feet. Nora raised her eyebrows in surprise. In her neighborhood, she had never encountered homeless children, neither begging nor just wandering the streets, especially at such a time. After all, decent people lived here, people who wouldn't let their children out at night. At the same time, they were not wealthy enough to attract beggars. Besides, the girl didn't look like a homeless child or even a child from a troubled family. She wore beautiful, clean, obviously new clothes and behaved not as one would expect from little vagabonds. The whole situation greatly surprised Nora. But this surprise was unimportant, more like background noise. She realized all these details much later, when replaying this strange encounter in her head. Right now, she was concerned only about one thing: a child alone on the street at night. It meant potential danger. She needed to help this girl. Guided by this thought, she cautiously approached the little girl, so as not to scare her, and squatted in front of her so that their faces were at the same level. Nora spoke softly and kindly. "Hello," she said. "What's your name?" "I don't know," the girl replied surprisingly calmly. "What do you mean?" Nora was surprised. "Just that. I mean, I probably knew once, but I forgot." "Who are your parents and where are they?" "I don't know, I don't remember," the girl said. "Don't you remember anything at all?" Nora asked cautiously. This time the girl didn't say anything, just silently shook her head. However, this answer did not satisfy the woman. "But how did you get here?" "I walked," the girl answered. "From where?" "From there." The child indifferently waved her hand, indicating the direction. "What was there?" "Some forest or park." "I don't know. I woke up there and couldn't remember anything. I just walked somewhere, and now I'm tired and decided to sit down." Nora shook her head in confusion. She didn't like this situation at all and had no idea what to do about it. Finally, after some silence and thought, she asked, "Are you hungry?" The girl nodded vigorously, indicating that she hadn't eaten in a very long time. "All right," Nora sighed tiredly. "Come with me, I'll feed you and you can spend the night at our apartment with my kids. And in the morning, we'll think about what to do with you. For convenience, I'll call you Maria for now, is that okay?" Yes, the newly named Maria responded quite indifferently. Taking the girl firmly by the hand, Nora headed home. All her own troubles and sorrows immediately flew out of her head. She was like that. If someone needed help, her own problems were secondary. Especially for her, as a mother, the situation with a homeless child who couldn't even remember her own name was unbearable. When they arrived at the apartment without any incidents around 2 in the morning, all Nora's household members, as she immediately saw, were peacefully sleeping in their beds. She felt a twinge of vague offense, as it seemed nobody cared where she was at such a late hour. On the other hand, she was relieved by this state of affairs. She had no desire to explain to her children and husband, especially her husband, where this girl came from and why she was in their apartment. She quietly went to the kitchen, took the leftovers from their modest dinner out of the fridge, and fed the little homeless girl. After eating, the girl started yawning desperately. It was clear that Maria had not only been hungry for a long time, but also hadn't slept. Nora decided to make a bed for her right there, on the sofa, and settled herself next to it on the floor. Exhausted by the day's events, she quickly fell asleep, even forgetting to set her alarm. As usual, she woke up earlier than everyone else in the house. She had to prepare breakfast, get her husband ready for work, and her eldest son for school. Besides, she was the only early bird in the family, and early mornings were not only habitual for her but also pleasant. However, this did not apply to those times when she had to go to bed late. Under such circumstances, waking up without an alarm was extremely difficult. Naturally, Nora overslept, and her awakening was not pleasant, as she was rudely awoken by someone shaking her shoulder. Opening her eyes, she saw Rodrigo's angry face right in front of her. "I'm late for work," he exclaimed, noticing that his wife had opened her eyes. "Breakfast isn't ready, you're still sleeping, and not even in bed, but on the kitchen floor. And please explain to me, what's this girl doing snoring on our sofa?" At first, Nora couldn't even remember which girl he was talking about. Then she recalled her nocturnal adventures and tried to explain everything to Rodrigo. He listened with a skeptical expression on his face and then declared that when he returned from work, Maria should no longer be in their house. Without having breakfast, he left for work, leaving Nora to slowly come to her senses. However, even this luxury was not available to her. Within a few minutes, she realized that her husband probably hadn't bothered to wake up Felito, let alone get him ready for school. Indeed, the child was still peacefully sleeping in his bed. And since Rodrigo was already late for work, it meant Felito should have left the house long ago. Looking at the clock for the first time that morning, Nora clutched her head. Her son's first lesson was to start in 10 minutes. Waking Felito up, she quickly prepared a simple breakfast and sent him off to school. Fortunately, the school was very close, and the boy could handle the journey on his own. Nonetheless, Nora knew he would still be late, which meant they would soon have related problems. But she didn't plan to think about that right now, as she had other difficulties that required immediate action. Fortunately, all the commotion in the house over the past half hour hadn't disturbed Maria's deep sleep. Her savior decided to wait until the girl woke up on her own and in the meantime take care of her little children and thoroughly consider what she should do next. The girl got up only 2 hours later, and by that time, Nora had developed a clear plan of action. It was time for a walk with the little ones, and she decided to take Maria with her to the nearest police station. After all, law enforcement exists precisely to deal with such cases. "So, you found this girl on the street last night?" the duty officer clarified. "Exactly. And she can't even remember her own name?" "That's right," Nora confirmed again. She didn't understand the point of this procedure. She had already told the whole story once, then recounted it again in a written statement. And now, reading her testimony, the police officer for some reason repeatedly asked about all the circumstances she had already repeatedly disclosed. "Why didn't you immediately contact the police?" he asked. "You see, I was very tired, and it just didn't occur to me that that was the right thing to do," Nora responded. "I see," sighed the duty officer. Maria, it seemed, either did not understand that they were talking about her, or she understood but did not attach much importance to it. Instead, she was curiously looking around the room they were in. Although, to Nora's eyes, there was nothing fascinating or just beautiful there. "And what do you plan to do with the child?" the police officer asked after a pause. "What do you mean?" Nora was surprised. The question shocked her. Until it was asked, she sincerely believed that the girl's fate was now the responsibility of law enforcement. "I mean what I said," the officer replied indifferently. "We can place her in a special institution or let her stay with you for now." Darkness clouded Nora's vision. The choice she was being offered was impossible. On one hand, her husband had made it quite clear that the girl should not be there by evening. And she herself understood all too well that they simply couldn't afford another child. They were barely managing with their own. All of this was clear and logical. But the flip side of the coin was the term special institution, an orphanage. Allowing that girl to end up there was unthinkable. Despite the years, Nora vividly remembered how hard it was for her to live and grow up in a foster home, enduring the taunts of other children and the cruel punishments of the caregivers. All that was in her past. She had endured and overcome. But that was her, who born into a troubled family, who lost even the parents she had at an early age. She was accustomed to difficulties from childhood. For her, such treatment was normal. Maria, however, was a completely different case. It was immediately clear that she was a domestic, beloved, maybe even slightly spoiled child. Moreover, she had a clear psychological trauma, as she couldn't remember either her past or even her own name. It was absolutely clear to Nora that this girl would not survive the harsh conditions of an orphanage. Of course, at that moment, Nora didn't have time to ponder all these lengthy and tedious thoughts. But undoubtedly, they were the motivation behind her decision. Looking into the officer's eyes, she firmly replied, "The girl will stay with us." "That's great," the officer replied. He clearly expected this answer and, receiving it, suddenly opened up. "I myself am from an orphanage. And I see that this girl clearly doesn't belong in such an institution." "That's what I thought," Nora replied rather coldly. "Generally speaking," he continued, oblivious to her tone, "keeping her with you is not exactly by the rules, but I'll try to sort it out." "All right," Nora responded. "Can we go?" "Yes, of course. If anything becomes known about the girl's relatives, we'll call you. But, to be honest, I would advise you to start your own search. Sometimes the internet can do more than the police." When Nora finally returned home, she found a distressed Filito. He had already come back from school and gloomily showed her his diary, which mentioned his tardiness and that his class teacher wanted to see her. "Sorry, Mom," Filito said guiltily. "I should have gotten up myself in the morning." "No, you shouldn't have," Nora replied. "You know waking everyone up in the morning is my responsibility. Not because it's supposed to be that way or anything like that, but because we agreed on it. So I'm the one who should apologize to you." Their conversation made it seem as if there was no strange girl in the apartment. Filito, though glancing at her with some bewilderment, tactfully didn't ask any questions. Nora thought again about how lucky she was with her son, who, even in early childhood, unlike many, even the twins, was an absolutely trouble-free child. After leaving the younger children in the care of the older ones, Nora started preparing lunch. Then they all sat down to eat. To her surprise, Filito and Maria had somehow managed to become friends and were chatting animatedly about something of their own. Only after the meal, when the girl was not around, did her son approach her with an obvious question. "Mom, is Maria going to live with us now?" "I asked her, but she doesn't know." "For now, yes, son," Nora replied. "The girl is lost, and she needs help. If we don't take her in, she'll end up in an orphanage." "It's good that she stays," Raphael unexpectedly concluded. "Why?" The mother was surprised. "The little ones like her," the son seriously told her. "So now it will be easier for us." Patting his hair, Nora laughed loudly and got busy with usual household chores, laundry, cleaning, cooking dinner for her husband's return. She preferred not to think about what would happen when he finally returned from work. However, the ensuing scandal exceeded all her expectations. "What the hell is this?" he almost shouted, pacing the kitchen. "Aren't your own enough for you? Picked up some ragamuffin." "She is not a ragamuffin," Nora defended the girl. "And anyway, it's temporary until her parents are found. We can't let her end up in an orphanage. Look at her. She is absolutely a domestic child. She has nothing to do there. It's exactly the kind of institution for someone like her, and she has no business being here. Have you even thought, our philanthropist, about what we will feed her, dress her, and about all the other expenses associated with keeping a child? What do you know about expenses related to children?" Nora flared up unexpectedly even for herself. "Have you ever bought anything for them? Do you have any idea what needs a child has?" She didn't even know what prompted her to start this accusatory speech. Perhaps deep-seated resentment had built up over the years, needing a release. Her husband listened to her angry confession incredibly quietly, without trying to interrupt or argue. He probably didn't expect such an onslaught from his usually gentle and calm wife, even in conflict situations. And Nora kept talking, pouring out all that had accumulated in her soul, about how his earnings were categorically insufficient for life, about how all this could have been avoided if he had got a job right away instead of sitting on her neck for several years. She even reminded him of various extravagances he allowed himself after their children were born, while she had to count every penny he gave her to somehow feed and clothe the whole family. She spoke not only about money, but also about how their relationship had deteriorated, how she missed the former love and romance. Not just flowers and gifts, of course, no. She wanted simple human attention and a bit of warmth and participation, instead of constant unfair reproaches. "Well then," Rodrigo said in an absolutely calm tone when Nora finally finished her monologue, "I understand that all of you will be much better off than with me." This ominous phrase hung in the air. And the man, without saying another word, took a large suitcase from the closet in the room and began to pack his things. Nora, it seemed, should have, seeing this, started crying and apologizing, telling her husband how she loved him, persuading him not to make hasty decisions. And just 2 days ago she would have done so, but now she watched what was happening with a composure that doomed her. Rodrigo was packing deliberately slowly, occasionally glancing at Nora. Obviously, he too expected the usual reaction from her and probably wanted to scare her more than actually leave. If so, his plan failed. And when the suitcase was fully packed, there was no turning back. "To hell with you then," he angrily threw at his wife and slammed the front door. Nora stood in the kitchen for several more minutes, then shrugged and went to the children's room. There, Maria and Raphael, as best they could, tried to calm down the younger children, obviously frightened by the terrible scene in the kitchen. The older ones themselves were as pale as chalk but, feeling their responsibility, tried not to panic. The woman hugged all four tightly. "Is Dad not coming back?" Raphael finally asked. Nora noted that there was not a hint of regret or, conversely, joy in his voice. In fact, he didn't care whether Dad returned or not. He was just clarifying information. No wonder, this man, rarely appearing at home even on weekends, was almost a stranger to the children. "I don't know," she honestly replied. "Maybe he'll come back after some time." So they started living, the five of them, for children and Nora herself. And if at first she feared that without her husband's help she would not be able to feed such a horde of hungry mouths, she soon found that this was not the case. On the contrary, life became much easier and calmer without constant scandals and absurd demands. And the money didn't decrease much. Rodrigo allocated a tiny sum of his salary for household expenses, while the main part was covered by Nora's maternity and child benefits. However, the time was approaching when the former would end, and this posed a certain problem. Nora understood that she couldn't work full-time with 4 small children. But unexpectedly, with Rodrigo's departure, she found the strength and time to slowly start looking for at least part-time options. And here several lucky incidents helped her. First, the director of the kindergarten, where her children were on the waiting list, called her. Without saying anything specific on the phone, she persuasively asked Nora to come to the institution for a personal conversation as soon as possible. "Hello," she began at the meeting. "As I understand, you've been waiting for a long time for your children to be admitted to our kindergarten." "So long that one of them has already started school," Nora replied somewhat irritably. "I'll tell you a secret," the director remarked. "By the time it's your turn, the younger ones will also be ready for school. Many remain without a kindergarten spot. There are unfortunately many more children than places, and don't look at me like that. I didn't invent this, and it's not in my power to change it. So, did you call me just to say that we have no chance? On the contrary, I called you to offer a solution to this problem. You see, some time ago another nanny in the nursery resigned. No one stays long, as you understand, and we can't find a replacement. The remaining staff is running off their feet and is also about to scatter. So, I thought of offering this vacancy to someone from the waiting list. Honestly, there's a lot of work, and the salary is small. But we can immediately admit your children to the age-appropriate group. Why are you offering this specifically to me?" Nora asked suspiciously. "After all, I don't even have a teaching degree." Surely there are more suitable candidates. But you do have 3 children of your own. Believe me, in the job that awaits you, this is far more important. However, I won't hide it. We also made such an offer to more suitable candidates, as you put it. But none of them agreed. Then we compiled a list of those who might be interested in such a deal. And you are not the first one I called. Does that answer satisfy you? Nora was satisfied with this answer. Now she had a job, albeit a modest one, which she could perfectly combine with caring for her younger children. The older ones were already independent enough to spend a few hours in the apartment without her and to warm up their lunch by themselves. Moreover, the kindergarten was located not far from their school and home. Of course, they weren't living lavishly, but not worse than before Rodrigo left. Life began to get on track, and after some time, a second fortunate event occurred. This time, the same duty officer from the police station, who had taken her statement about finding Maria on the street a few weeks ago, called her in. Any news about her parents? Nora asked hopefully. Alas, none, the officer replied. As I told you, we're not very good at such things. Especially since we have minimal data on her. Have you tried searching yourself? It never really crossed my mind, Nora shrugged. I have 3 of my own, you know, and my husband just left, so. I see, the officer sighed. Well, basically, I called you for a specific matter. I've finally managed to officially arrange Maria's stay with you. This means you can now enroll her in school and all that. Excellent. Nora beamed. The fact that Maria couldn't go to school really stressed her out. So far, she had been teaching her herself, but understood that this issue had to be resolved no later than the start of the next school year. And with summer rapidly approaching, it meant the problem would soon become pressing. Besides, you are becoming her official guardian. This, of course, implies some payments. Also, as I understand, you can claim certain benefits and allowances as a mother of many children. Everything turned out just as he said. Of course, money was always tight, but now, at least, Nora could be sure that the children would be clothed, fed, and placed in educational institutions. Contrary to her fears, life without Rodrigo did not collapse, neither materially nor emotionally. Try as she might, she couldn't feel anything about his departure. Something in her must have snapped the moment her husband rashly accused her of non-existent infidelity. This reaction surprised Nora herself, but nonetheless, it pleased her. With 4 children on her hands, pining over a failed love was the last thing she needed. On the other hand, perhaps the children themselves contributed to her tranquility. With all the worries, she simply had no time to indulge in sadness and despair. 2 more years passed. For the convenience of all family members, it was decided to conditionally divide the apartment into 2 halves, male and female. The room where the adults used to live, now occupied by Nora, was taken over by Maria and the younger Lacha. Felito and his brother Juan remained in their room. It was a bit cramped, but for the time being, it didn't create any particular problems. The friendship between Maria and Felito grew stronger every day. They now went to the same school, though the girl was a grade below. The boy treated her like another younger sister, taking great care of her. She also got along wonderfully with the younger children. In short, despite her unexpected arrival, she fit perfectly into the family. Nora herself grew to love the girl as her own daughter and sometimes even forgot that this was not the case. Maria, in turn, quickly got used to calling the woman mom and her children brothers and sisters. The day the girl was found was unanimously decided to be celebrated as her birthday. Nora found this quite symbolic, for who knows what could have happened to Maria if she hadn't been found in time. In some way, the terrible scene caused by Rodrigo that evening saved the little girl from a much sadder fate. And although Nora was glad that Maria was now her daughter, she couldn't understand, wasn't the girl being searched for by anyone? Following the policeman's advice, she repeatedly placed ads about the found child, all to no avail. The police also had no success in finding her parents. Adding to the worries was the fact that the girl's real memories never returned. It seemed as if, until the moment she woke up in the park, she simply didn't exist in this world, which of course couldn't be true, and Nora really wanted to know the real story. But various doctors in the budget clinic could only shrug. They had never encountered such severe cases and had no idea what to do in such a situation. The only thing one of them could do was to give contacts to a good private clinic specializing in helping children who had lost their memory. But, of course, the family had no money for that. Maria herself didn't seem to be troubled by the absence of memories of the past. She naively lived in the present day and knew only that she was happy in it. What happened before all this didn't seem important to her. Nora couldn't understand this either and even somewhat envied her adoptive daughter. At her age, she very much wanted to know who her parents were and why they were no longer with her. She pestered her caretaker with questions until she finally answered honestly and directly. They were good-for-nothing drunks, she hissed through her teeth. Useless and worthless, just like you. Then they died, and you were dumped on our heads. Got the answers you wanted? Satisfied? Now go scrub the toilets. It's your turn today. Remembering this episode, Nora sometimes thought that maybe it was good that Maria showed no interest to her past. On the other hand, when Nora found her, the girl didn't look like a child who had been terribly unlucky in life. Rather, quite the opposite. And she often thought that living with her own family might have been much more comfortable and pleasant for the girl than with them. However, one way or another, Nora could not change anything in this situation, despite her best efforts. And eventually, she resigned herself to the idea that they would never know the whole truth. And, perhaps, it was at this moment that she finally decided the girl was not just temporarily living with her, but a full-fledged member of her family. Then the question arose of not just being her guardian, but formally adopting the child. And here she faced a funny and simultaneously sad legal nuance. Still being in an official marriage, she couldn't do this without the husband's consent. This meant only one thing: she had to get a divorce. With a heavy heart, Nora dialed Rodrigo's number. She didn't want to talk to this man at all and would have much preferred to do this through court, but such a process would have taken much more time. And the woman hoped that her husband, whom she hadn't contacted for 2 years, would agree to just file an application amicably and part ways, not only factually but also officially. Nora, she heard Rodrigo's tender voice on the phone. How glad I am that you finally called me. You have no idea how much I've missed you. Nora was dumbfounded. On the one hand, something painfully and at the same time sweetly stung her heart. That's how he used to talk to her before all the horror that happened to them. And for a moment, she seemed to return to those happy times. On the other hand, it sounded extremely inappropriate now. I knew you missed me too and would eventually make the right decision, Rodrigo continued enthusiastically. You can't just abandon your husband because of some street girl. You're calling to say that this problem is resolved and I can come back? Any trace of happy memories vanished. With his last phrase, her husband vividly reminded Nora why, when he left, she didn't even get too upset about it, and she responded in the coldest tone possible. Rui, I'm calling to ask you for a divorce. So, you found yourself a new man? His voice immediately lost all its tenderness. That was quick, to say the least. I haven't found anyone, and besides, it's none of your business since you left me alone with 4 children. As you said then, we managed to live perfectly well without you, and now I would like to settle this last formality. I didn't abandon you, the husband said indignantly. I just couldn't stay in the same apartment with that girl and couldn't handle another child, so I stepped out of your life until you resolved this issue. Oh, believe me, I've perfectly solved all my problems, except for one, which is why I'm calling you. Let's end this useless conversation, Rui. You are no longer needed by me or my children. Well then, now his voice was filled with real fury. In that case, file for divorce in court. I won't give you a divorce. I just advise you to think carefully before doing this and, for example, remember that our apartment was acquired during our marriage. It's jointly acquired property. And now I'm forced to live with my parents, who are not too keen on having me here. You understand what I'm getting at?" With those words, he hung up the phone. Nora couldn't believe what she had just heard. Was he really not going to give her a divorce? Moreover, he threatened to deprive her and the children of their only home if she decided to go through with it. Was this really the romantic and loving young man she had once married? But she had no choice but to go forward. After several more attempts to amicably reach an agreement with her husband, she realized that it was all in vain. Either she gets rid of Maria and Rodrigo comes back home, or it's a court divorce with the division of the apartment. He wouldn't hear of any other options. "I understand that you still need time to come to your senses," he said in one of these conversations, "and I'm not rushing you to make a decision. But, since you've deigned to talk to me, keep in mind, I'm waiting for your decision, and even my patience has its limits." Nora herself didn't want to prolong all this, maintaining a sort of status quo. It was clear that this issue couldn't be suspended indefinitely. It had to be resolved right now. In the end, officially adopting Maria was also a formality, like this divorce. That's true. But what if, for instance, she wanted to remarry? Eventually, Nora decided to file a lawsuit in court. Before that, she did one thing: tried to explain to the children, in terms they could understand, that soon their living conditions might become even worse than they had been before, and for at least some time, they would all have to squeeze into a one-bedroom apartment. To her surprise and delight, everyone understood this decision. Rodrigo kept his word and indeed tried to sue for his share of the apartment. However, unexpectedly for everyone, the court denied his request. The judge referred to the fact that all their children lived in that apartment with their mother. Moreover, it was the only place of residence for another child, so dividing the apartment was not possible. Unless, of course, the unfortunate father decided to take some of the children to live with him. A menacing silence hung in the air. The children were still too young for the court to consider their opinions and wishes. Therefore, at that moment, everything depended on Rodrigo's answer. For a few minutes, he triumphantly looked at his former wife. She understood that he didn't need the children, but to rattle her nerves, he might agree to this proposal. And then they would face many more months of new legal battles, fighting for children that he would, of course, lose, but all of this would take time and money from Nora, not to mention millions of nerve cells. However, the husband apparently decided that he didn't need these problems either, and agreed that the children should stay with their mother, but in that case, he was entitled to compensation in the amount of the market value of his half of the apartment. The court agreed to this. Despite Nora's modest income and the number of dependents, she had to pay these sums in small amounts over many years. Neither party was fully satisfied with this decision, but it was the only possible compromise. Nora's family saw this as an absolute victory. The children, despite being prepared by her, were scared by the legal process, especially by the prospect of being separated and forced to live with a father whom the younger ones didn't even remember. Now that it was all behind them, the kids were jubilant. Furthermore, being a completely free woman and longtime guardian of Maria, Nora, though not without difficulty, managed to achieve the girl's official adoption. This became the reason for a big celebration by their standards. The essentials were an inexpensive but tasty cake from the store and a trip to the amusement park. None of Nora's children had ever been to such a place, but of course, each of them dreamed of visiting at least once. For 3 months, the woman cut back on all possible expenses just to save enough money for this trip and to give her children a real treat. Finally, the significant day arrived. The kids eagerly looked around, trying to decide which of the various entertainments they wanted to try. Of course, trying everything was out of the question. Fortunately, even the little ones understood these limitations. Only Maria, usually noisy and cheerful, behaved quietly. She looked around with a strange expression on her face, as if surprised why she was in this place, but this surprise was of a completely different kind than everyone else's. Maria paid very little attention to the attractions themselves. It seemed they were well known to her. "Maria, is everything okay?" Nora asked, concerned by the girl's unusual behavior. Yes, everything's fine, she replied in a quiet, colorless voice. This struck the woman even more. The child's intonation was completely at odds with the content of her words, which was entirely uncharacteristic for Maria. Open and trusting, she was not used to hiding her emotions, so her attempt to do so was utterly unsuccessful and even more alarming to her adoptive mother. However, Nora did not continue this dialogue. She understood that if Maria had any reason to try to hide her feelings, no matter how much she questioned her, it would only lead to the girl becoming even more withdrawn. Otherwise, there was a good chance that she would want to share her feelings on her own. And that's what happened. Nora's biological children, completely mesmerized by the surrounding environment, did not notice anything around and excitedly argued about which attraction to try first. Eventually, they came to a common decision and went to the Ferris wheel. Maria unexpectedly refused to go with them, citing a fear of heights. No one tried to persuade her. She and Nora sat on a bench from which they could clearly see the cabin of the wheel where the others were, along its entire path. After a while of awkward silence, the girl broke it with a phrase that her adoptive mother least expected to hear. "Mom, just don't be mad at me," she began and paused mid-sentence, trying to read Nora's reaction in her eyes. "Have I ever been angry with you?" Nora replied, surprised. "No," Maria said, embarrassed, "but you might now." "Why, sunshine? What's wrong?" "You see, ever since we came to this park, I feel like I know it, as if I've been here before." "Maybe I really have." "I'm not." Maria trailed off again. Nora felt a surge of excitement. Could it be that Maria's memories were returning? Could her real parents have brought her to this park or a similar one, and now the surroundings were helping her recover her memory? Why would I be angry at that? What if? What if I remember everything, my childhood and my other parents? What's so bad about that? Then we'll definitely know what happened to you. Maybe we can even find these people and tell them you're okay. But then they'll surely want to take me away," Maria exclaimed, almost in horror. "It won't be that simple," Nora tried to reassure her. "You'll be 9 soon, maybe even older. We don't even know for sure. You've seen yourself how slow the court process is, and it can't be bypassed. But once you turn 10, you can decide which family you want to live with, and maybe your real parents will be more to your liking than me." "No way," Maria pouted. "How can you be so sure?" "They abandoned me," Maria said with childlike certainty. "Maybe they didn't abandon you, maybe they just lost you and still can't find you. Anyway, I've already gotten used to all of you, to you, and to the brothers, and to the sister. I've been trying very hard not to remember anything for a long time, so that. Maria couldn't find the right words, but Nora understood her perfectly, so that she would avoid facing this impossible choice. Surely, she loved her real parents. If she remembers them, those feelings might return. But the new family had already become practically her own. "Listen," Nora said as gently as possible, "you might think there are only 2 options, but in reality, there are many more. If it happens that we find your real parents, you don't necessarily have to say goodbye to us forever. You can visit us, play with the brothers and sister quite often. I'm sure, whoever these people are, they love you, and understanding that this is better for you, they won't stand in the way." Maria's eyes widened. It seemed she had never considered this possibility, but now her thoughts flowed in this direction, and the girl calmed down slightly, realizing that everything was not as hopeless as she had imagined. Unfortunately, Nora herself couldn't say the same. She wasn't at all sure about the fairness of her own reassuring words. It's unknown how much longer this conversation would have lasted and where it would have ultimately led, had it not been interrupted quite abruptly. A person dressed in the uniform of an amusement park worker approached them. He held a broom in his hands and didn't look very friendly. However, when he spoke, his words were polite and without any aggression. "Hello. I'm sorry to bother you, but your daughter seemed very familiar to me. Could she be Veronica by any chance?" Upon hearing this name, the girl jolted. From the outside, she resembled a lost dog that hears its name in a random conversation between strangers. She started to gaze intently at the janitor, as if trying to recall if she had ever met him before. "You see, here's the thing," Nora replied cautiously, choosing her words. "We don't really know and can't rule out that she might be. The fact is, this girl was found about 3 years ago quite far from here. She was wandering the streets at night hour, remembered absolutely nothing about her past, and unfortunately, she still doesn't. If you really know her." 3 years ago?" exclaimed the janitor, astonished. "Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but that was exactly when I, and anyone else for that matter, last saw the girl I'm talking about. Of course, she looked much younger then, but the resemblance is striking." "Start from the beginning, please," Nora suggested. While the janitor sighed and gathered his thoughts, the children who had been on the Ferris wheel returned. However, Felito, from just one look at his mother, understood that something serious was happening, and clearly, it was not the right time to interrupt. He distracted the younger ones with some triviality and then carefully took them to a new attraction. "You see, they used to come here often, the Montero family. But I later learned that was their name. Father, mother, and a little girl," he finally started. "They appeared here almost every week and then disappeared. At that time, I didn't think much of it. Maybe they found another park they liked more or something. Those days, all sorts of entertainment things were popping up all over the city like mushrooms after the rain." "And then what?" Maria asked, listening to him as if spellbound. "Then I saw an ad in the newspaper that this girl went missing. The parents were offering crazy money for any information about her whereabouts, but, as I understood, they never found her." "Do you still have a copy of that newspaper?" Nora asked with a mix of fear and hope. "No, the newspaper's gone," the janitor replied. "But if you're interested in these people's contacts, I saved them just in case I see or hear something." Rummaging through his pocket, he pulled out an old button phone, found the necessary number, and dictated it to Nora. "It would be good if you turned out to be Veronica," he told Maria in the end. The parents, as far as I could see, adored her. Nora and Maria returned home in a strange, agitated state. Perhaps the solution to the mystery that had been troubling them for 3 years was right in their hands, but neither of them knew where its revelation would lead. Perceptive Felito, of course, noticed that something was off, but he didn't ask any unnecessary questions. On the contrary, he diligently drew the attention of Lacha and Juan to himself, so they wouldn't bother their mother. For several days in a row, Nora held the phone in her hands, dialing the cherished number and then quickly hanging up before the call went through. It wasn't even that she was afraid of what she might learn. She just had no idea how to start this difficult conversation. But at some point, gathering her strength, she finally took this decisive step into the unknown. "Hello. How can I help you?" A pleasant male voice answered after a few rings. "Hello," Nora said, then abruptly exhaled and continued, "My name is Eleonora. I'm calling about your daughter, who disappeared about 3 years ago." "What?" The conversationalist's polite, neutral, friendly tone immediately changed. The man was obviously shocked by what he heard and had absolutely no idea how to react, whether to rejoice, get angry, or be scared. What information could this unknown woman provide him? "You see, there's a chance that she's been under my care all this time and was recently adopted by me. I can't say for sure, as the girl has lost her memory for some reason and had no idea about her relatives. I don't want to give you false hope, but a few days ago, she was seemingly recognized by a janitor at the amusement park." "I think we need to meet and discuss this," the man replied hoarsely. "You're right, but I prefer the first meeting to be without the girl. Why unnecessarily upset either her or you?" "Agreed," he replied. Just a few hours later, Nora, terribly nervous, entered one of the city's most expensive restaurants. A man was already waiting for her at the designated table. He was perhaps a decade older than her, but it did not diminish his attractiveness. Even in such a setting, she couldn't help but notice that he looked simply magnificent. "Hello again," she said, sitting down opposite him. He nodded silently. Either he didn't want to say anything, or he simply couldn't. Still silent, he took a folder out of his business briefcase, placed it on the table, and cautiously slid it toward his interlocutor. In turn, she handed him several simple film photographs of Maria. Opening the folder, Nora discovered that the stranger had the same idea as her. He brought a few pictures of his daughter, taken shortly before her disappearance in that very amusement park. In one of the photos, she posed in a pink dress, which she was wearing on the night the woman found her on the street. There could be no doubt. The images unmistakably showed Maria. Nora didn't have any photos of the girl from the same period. Only the most recent shots taken on a cheap camera bought secondhand from an advertisement website. Despite this, the man unmistakably recognized his daughter. "This is Veronica," he whispered. "God, she's alive. And as far as I know, absolutely healthy, except for the memory loss. I'm afraid, though, that I couldn't provide the level of living she was used to. But the alternative was an orphanage, and I thought that even my modest 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts was better than that." The man fell silent again. Nora didn't rush him. She roughly understood the storm raging inside this man's soul. Eventually, it subsided a bit, and he managed to put words into sentences. The first thing he said was quite unexpected. "I haven't introduced myself yet. I'm Osvaldo." "Very nice to meet you," Nora responded mechanically. He faltered. "Forgive me, I am in some shock right now. But in any case, I must thank you for sheltering my girl. I've been trying to find her parents for quite a while, but it seems we somehow missed each other," she cautiously began. "You mainly advertised in newspapers, I guess, while I posted them online. And I didn't even think about the internet," Osvaldo sighed. "And nobody suggested it. Though I've always been told I'm too old-fashioned, especially for my age. Did you report it to the police?" "I did, of course," he sighed, "but they couldn't find anything. Strange, I went to the police first thing too. But then their officer told me they probably couldn't do much. Although, I didn't know her name then, and apparently, it's needed for them to check their channels." Speaking of which, Osvaldo grew noticeably gloomier. "You said she lost her memory." "Unfortunately, yes. I took her to doctors, but they couldn't do anything either. However, when we were in that very park, she seemed to faintly recognize the place. Maybe if she sees you, it might trigger more memories." "I would like to believe that," Osvaldo responded with another heavy sigh. "There's just one problem, though." "What do you mean?" "You see, the girl has lived in our family as our own blood. She's very attached to me and, perhaps even more importantly, to my children. And I, excuse my bluntness, will insist that they continue to communicate if, of course, you intend to take her with you. You're not very wealthy, are you?" Osvaldo suddenly inquired. "I'm not ashamed of it, and I assure you, Veronica, gets everything she needs for life." "I'm not hinting at that," he said. "I just think I have a proposal for you that will suit all parties, unless you're too attached to your job." "What exactly are you proposing?" "You see, I'm a lonely, very busy man and not at all sure I can devote enough time to my child. Understand, I've thrown myself into work after everything that happened. I have a large mansion in the suburbs. Move in with me along with your children. You'll be a live-in nanny. Don't worry about the school. You can send the kids there with a personal driver. Actually, we have an elite institution nearby. I think we can fit not only Veronica but also her new brothers or sisters there. You said you have several biological children?" "3, confirmed Nora. And 2 of them are supposed to go to school this year. So, do you agree?" "It's a very tempting offer," Nora thoughtfully replied. "Only I don't understand one thing. That park janitor said you always came there in 3s. Where's your wife?" Osvaldo lowered his eyes to the table, but Nora caught a glimpse of tears betraying him. Only now did she realize how foolish and tactless her question was. They had lost a child. Perhaps they thought the girl was no longer alive. Who knows what could have happened to the mother under such circumstances? You see, Osvaldo began, quickly regaining control over his emotions. Veronica was a long-awaited and beloved late child. We wanted a big family, but for a long time, we had no luck. And then our daughter came. But the doctor said that Irene's body simply wouldn't withstand a second childbirth. And then our only daughter disappeared, and now she's been found. My poor wife just missed this moment by a few months. She fell ill shortly after Veronica disappeared and has now passed away. I'm sorry, Nora quietly said. I sympathize with your loss. He nodded and took a sip of water from the glass in front of him. For a few painful minutes, they sat in awkward silence. Then, wishing to change the subject to something less painful, they began to discuss the details of moving and Maria Veronica's meeting with her biological father. As a result, Nora returned home with a clear plan of action. Her biological children took the move to the large Montero mansion as a magical adventure. Even Felito, always mature and serious beyond his years, was nearly jumping for joy. Only Maria didn't show any signs of happiness. She still didn't remember her father and was scared to meet him. Moreover, she was noticeably upset by the news of her mother's death. I don't remember her now, she told Nora. And I'm not even sad. But if I remember, it'll probably hurt me. That's why I prefer to tell you about it now, so you'll be prepared when you remember, the woman replied. Another 2 weeks passed before the family was fully ready to move. Finally, the day arrived when Maria Veronica was to meet her biological father. Everyone involved and witnessing this event, except maybe little Lacha and Juan, were terribly nervous. Even Felito was visibly anxious for his sister. Osvaldo organized the transportation of their belongings and sent his personal driver for the family. The entire trip, the girl sat on edge, fidgeting, bouncing, unable to focus on anything. However, as they left the city, she suddenly froze, staring out the window as if recognizing the landscapes outside. And as the car approached the mansion, she screamed out loud. Osvaldo, no less nervous than his daughter, waited for them right on the doorstep. The girl got out of the car and stood still, looking either at him or at the house. Her father moved forward, then hesitated and eventually remained in place, just starting to nervously shift from foot to foot. She approached him and said in a half-questioning tone, "Dad? Veronica, my daughter, do you remember me?" It was evident that he was restraining his desire to hug the child, not to scare her. After all, he perfectly understood that he was probably no more than some strange man to her at this moment. Even though she was told he was her father, she likely didn't remember or feel it. "Vaguely," said the girl. "I sort of remember something, but I'm not sure. Maybe I just made it up, And unable to withstand the emotional intensity, she burst into tears. Nora and Felito immediately rushed to her, enclosing her in a tight embrace. "It's okay," her foster mother said. "Nothing to worry about, darling. Give yourself time. You will remember everything. Let's not rush things." The last phrase was more addressed to Osvaldo. He, however, didn't think of taking any action, realizing the complex situation they all were in. Suddenly turning around, he went into the house, gesturing the new residents to follow him. The family had been living in the mansion for a whole month, but the girl's memory showed no signs of returning. Occasionally, she seemed to recall some fragments, but even she couldn't understand whether they were real or just her imagination. Finally, after consulting, Osvaldo and Nora decided to seek professional help. Somehow, the woman had found a business card of a private clinic given to her once by a doctor at the city hospital. Osvaldo could afford the services of its specialists, and Maria Veronica began to visit the institution regularly. "Don't expect immediate results from us," one of the doctors warned them. "Memory restoration can take many months, even years, especially if it was lost due to a traumatic experience." "You think she suffered some trauma?" Osvaldo asked worriedly. "I'm talking about psychological trauma," the doctor clarified. Our examination found no physical injuries. But the mere fact that she got lost could have triggered a memory block, especially if she decided that she would never return home. It's like a protective mechanism, and now we need to convince her brain that it's no longer needed. That same evening, after putting the children to bed, Nora knocked on Osvaldo's door. He sat at his desk, writing something in a thick notebook. "Do you need something?" he asked politely. "Osvaldo, I wanted to ask you, but I couldn't decide. Tell me, how did Veronica disappear? Call her by her usual name if you like. Anyway, she doesn't respond to Veronica, and it's not certain she ever will. As for the circumstances of her disappearance, I actually know almost nothing. That evening, my wife and I put her to bed, and in the morning she was gone. We searched the house and the surrounding area but found nothing. There were no surveillance cameras at our place or on the road back then, and we didn't find any signs of strangers in the house. It was as if she left on her own. But as far as I understand, she had no reason to act like that?" "As far as I know, no," Osvaldo replied. 6 months of treatment at the clinic finally showed the first results, and they were the happiest for the girl's father. She finally remembered him. This was revealed early in the morning when a happy Maria Veronica ran down the stairs to the living room, where Osvaldo was having breakfast, and hugged him. Of course, this didn't negate her love and attachment to her new family, and only now did she truly rejoice that they all lived in one spacious house. Since then, she started responding to both her names, and when it was time to get her passport, she insisted that both be recorded. From that day on, her memory gradually returned. The girl remembered episodes from her childhood, her mother, neighborhood children she loved to play with. By her 14th birthday, she remembered almost everything, except for one thing: what exactly happened on the day she disappeared and how she ended up on the other side of the city. It was only after another 2 years that these memories began to return to her. Not immediately, but very gradually. At first, they appeared as vague images, mostly in dreams, but gradually they became clearer until they finally formed a complete picture. And it was at that moment that Maria Veronica was finally able to tell her parents everything. The solution turned out to be absurdly simple and banal. "I went after a cat," she said. "Which cat?" Nora was surprised. "A beautiful white one. He was wandering in our yard, and I couldn't sleep. I watched him from the window. And then he left the yard, and I became curious about where he was going. So, I climbed out of the window. My room was on the ground floor at the time, and I went after him. I thought it wouldn't be far, just a quick look. I went out of the yard, but he was already gone. I went one way, then another, trying to find him, but he was nowhere to be found. Maybe he ran off to do his cat business, or perhaps he was a domestic cat, just out for a walk and went back home. I was actually planning to go back when I realized I wouldn't find the cat anyway." "So, you just got lost?" Osvaldo was surprised. "Well, yes, that's what happened. And apparently, as I tried to return, I kept moving further and further away from home. By morning, I had reached the city, frozen, tired, and hungry, of course. I decided I could take a bus. I had seen them running here. So, I went, but in the wrong direction, of course. And to tell the truth, the bus was probably the wrong one too. So, I wandered around the city for several days until I reached the other end of it. I guess no one thought to look for me there. I hadn't slept all that time, I was scared. But at some point, my body couldn't take it anymore, and I fell asleep right on a park bench. When I woke up, I didn't remember anything. I just walked wherever my eyes took me, and then my mom found me. So, that's pretty much the whole story." Around the same time that Maria Veronica's memories returned, Osvaldo and Nora decided to get married. Living in the same house, they became very close and found many common interests. And Nora's own children had long regarded her new husband as their father. He responded in kind. Nora fulfilled her childhood dream. She went back to college, majoring in economics, and graduated with honors. After that, her husband gladly hired her to work in his company. She sold her old apartment, fully paying off Rodrigo for his half of the living space. That's how they lived, a big happy family in a huge mansion that had now become their common home. In memory of her adventures, Maria Veronica brought home a huge white cat from somewhere. The street animal needed a long course of treatment. Her parents complained for a long time about their daughter's reckless act, but they kept the cat. Very soon, he became the beloved pet of the household.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe.